Do I think...
Do you favour some immigrants? Let's suppose one from Mogadishu, with the same skills, the same ability to speak English, but not as a first language, from one from Melbourne.
Do you have a
preference? Do you have a preference?
I have to confess, I do have a slight preference.
Nigel Farage and Joe Rogan, two of the most influential and controversial voices in contemporary politics and media, have recently joined forces to launch a blistering attack on UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer. In a shocking and highly publicized podcast episode, the pair leveled scathing criticisms at Starmer, accusing him of weak leadership, failed policies.
Well, do you think it would be a good idea if you had if you were running your own immigration policy, which of course Britain doesn't, because we're EU members, do you think it'd be a good idea to get a lot of people to come who didn't speak English? Do you think that would aid and abet integration in society? Well, the answer, of course, to that clearly is no.
And blaming him directly for the anti-immigration riots that have rocked the United Kingdom. Their argument hinges on the claim that Starmer's inability to tackle the immigration crisis head-on has exacerbated social tensions, leading to the outbreak of violence and unrest across the nation. Before we start, hit the like and subscribe buttons for more exclusive news. Nigel Farage, a prominent figure in British politics and one of the key architects of Brexit, has long been known for his fierce opposition to uncontrolled immigration and his advocacy for British sovereignty.
The desperate plight of migrants seeking refuge in the United Kingdom has taken a harrowing turn in recent months.
Come here!
Farage's reputation as a staunch critic of the establishment has endeared him to a significant portion of the British public who feel that their concerns about immigration and national identity have been ignored by mainstream politicians. His partnership with Joe Rogan, an American comedian, commentator, and host of one of the world's most popular podcasts, represents a powerful fusion of British political commentary with global media influence. Rogan, who has millions of listeners around the globe, has built a reputation for unfiltered and often controversial discussions on a wide range of topics, making him a perfect partner for Farage in this scathing critique. In their explosive conversation, Farage and Rogan did not mince words when discussing Keir Starmer's tenure as Prime Minister.
40% of the Britons have said that they have a favourable view of Starmer, and this is down 4 points in just a fortnight. At least 49% people have an unfavourable view of him, and this is up by 5 points from the previous time. Starmer is also losing support among Labour voters. A 79% vast majority continues to back him.
Farage, who has never hidden his disdain for what he sees as the liberal elite's failure to address the concerns of ordinary people, accused Starmer of being out of touch with the realities of immigration and the impact it has on communities across the UK. He argued that Starmer's leadership has been marked by a lack of decisive action, particularly on the issue of immigration, which Farage claims has spiraled out of control under the Labour government. Farage pointed to the recent anti-immigration riots as evidence that the British public has reached a breaking point, driven to violence out of frustration with a government that refuses to listen to their concerns. Joe Rogan, who often plays the role of the everyman in his interviews, echoed Farage's sentiments, expressing disbelief that the UK government could allow such a situation to develop. Rogan, who has a keen interest in political and social issues,
the public service is a privilege, and that your government should treat every single person in this country with respect. If you voted Labour yesterday, we will carry the responsibility of your trust as we rebuild our country.
Questioned how a country with the resources and capabilities of the United Kingdom could fail so dramatically in managing immigration. He criticized Starmer's government for what he perceived as a failure to protect the interests of British citizens, arguing that the unchecked influx of immigrants has strained public services, fueled social tensions, and contributed to a sense of insecurity among the populace. The discussion between Farage and Rogan delved into the root causes of the immigration crisis.
What we want to do is to change our relationship with the European Union, take back control of our borders, and put in place a positive immigration policy, one that the people of Britain would overwhelmingly support, and by that I mean we want an Australian-style point system to decide who comes to live, work and settle in this country.
With both men agreeing that Starmer's government has been unwilling or unable to implement effective policies to control the flow of immigrants into the country. Farage argued that the government's open-door policies and its failure to secure the UK's borders have allowed large numbers of immigrants to enter the country without proper vetting, leading to overcrowded housing, overwhelmed public services, and a growing sense of resentment among native-born citizens. He claimed that Starmer's reluctance to take a firm stance on immigration has emboldened those who wish to exploit the system, while simultaneously alienating those who feel that their concerns are being ignored.
The smugglers run off. They've had a good night, but one told us he now had a shortage of customers and blamed the impact of the government's Rwanda law. Near Dunkirk, and it's breakfast time in a camp. Omar's cooking. 2 years ago, he paid smugglers $15,000 to get him from Kurdistan to Britain.
Rogan, who has often spoken about the importance of national sovereignty and the need for countries to control their own borders, was quick to agree with Farage's assessment. He argued that the situation in the UK is emblematic of a broader problem facing many Western nations, where political leaders are increasingly disconnected from the concerns of their citizens. Rogan suggested that Starmer's government, like many others in the West, is more concerned with appeasing globalist interests and maintaining a politically correct image than with addressing the real issues facing the country. This, he argued, has led to a growing backlash from ordinary people who feel that their voices are being silenced and their needs are being ignored. As the conversation progressed, Farage and Rogan explored the social and cultural impacts of the immigration crisis.
And speaking of the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer's honeymoon in office seems to have ended. Since his dramatic election in July, Starmer's favourability ratings have dipped as much as 9 points, and this is according to a YouGov poll. The Labour leader garnered high ratings during and immediately after the 2024 elections. An earlier YouGov poll from July recorded an 8% increase in number of Britons who prefer Starmer,
with both men expressing concern about the erosion of national identity and the rise of social tensions. Farage, who has long championed the idea of British exceptionalism and the importance of preserving the country's cultural heritage, argued that unchecked immigration is leading to the fragmentation of British society. He claimed that the influx of immigrants from different cultural backgrounds has led to the creation of parallel societies within the UK, where different groups live in isolation from one another and where the values and traditions that once united the nation are being undermined. Rogan, who has often discussed the importance of cultural cohesion on his podcast, agreed with Farage's assessment. He argued that the failure to integrate immigrants into the broader society.
Migration has been turned into a flagship issue by parties, especially on the right. And so just the fact that migration is on the political agenda, that the images of irregular arrivals are constantly broadcast by televisions across Europe, is putting the agenda pushed by these parties much more at the forefront of the political discussion.
Has contributed to a sense of alienation and resentment among both immigrants and native-born citizens. This, he suggested, is a recipe for social unrest, as different groups compete for limited resources and as long-standing cultural norms are challenged. Rogan pointed to the recent riots as evidence that these tensions are reaching a boiling point, and he warned that unless the government takes action to address the underlying issues, the situation is likely to get worse. Farage and Rogan also discussed the political ramifications of the immigration crisis, with both men predicting that it could lead to a significant realignment of British politics. Farage, who has long been a thorn in the side of the Conservative and Labour parties alike, argued that the public's frustration with the government's handling of immigration could lead to the rise of new political movements.
Age groups, 54% of 18 to 24-year-olds thinks that immigration has a positive effect. But the older you get, the lower this number comes down. When you get to 65 and over, only 20% of these people thought immigration is good for society.
That are more in tune with the concerns of ordinary people. He pointed to the success of Brexit as an example of how the British public is willing to defy the political establishment when it feels that its interests are being ignored. Rogan, who has a keen interest in the dynamics of political change, suggested that the situation in the UK could be part of a broader trend of populist movements challenging the status quo in Western democracies. He argued that as traditional political parties continue to fail in addressing the concerns of their constituents, they are leaving a vacuum that can be filled by new, more radical voices.
Across Europe, migration is resurging as a key political battleground. It's propelling support for far-right parties and is fomenting spats between EU member states, aggravating divides between the countries migrants travel through and those they want to reach.
Rogan warned that if the mainstream parties do not take steps to address the immigration issue and to reconnect with their base, they could find themselves facing a serious challenge from the fringes of the political spectrum. Throughout their conversation, both Farage and Rogan were careful to emphasize that their criticism of Starmer was not rooted in xenophobia or racism, but rather in a genuine concern for the well-being of the country and its citizens. Farage, who has often been accused of stoking anti-immigrant sentiment, insisted that his opposition to uncontrolled immigration is based on practical considerations.
Look, whichever way you cut this, immigration is the #1 issue in British politics. It has been for some years. The opinion polls are astonishing. 77% of the British public want cuts to the numbers coming into Britain, and over half the voters want a reduction to near zero. So people are very upset, they're very unhappy, they're seeing the impact on local schools, they're seeing the impact on GP services, they're seeing the impact on housing or the inability of young people to get on the housing ladder. So that's why it's the #1 issue.
Such as the strain on public services and the need to maintain social cohesion. Rogan, who has a diverse audience and who has often spoken out against racism, echoed this sentiment, arguing that it is possible to be concerned about immigration without being prejudiced against immigrants. Despite their harsh criticism of Starmer, Farage and Rogan acknowledged that the immigration crisis is a complex issue with no easy solutions. They agreed that while it is important to control the flow of immigrants into the country, it is also important to ensure that those who do come to the UK are able to integrate successfully into society. Farage argued that the government needs to do more to promote integration.
Now our country has voted decisively for change, for national renewal, and a return of politics to public service. When the gap between the sacrifices made by people and the service they receive from politicians grows this big,
and to ensure that immigrants are able to contribute to the country in a positive way. Rogan, who has often spoken about the importance of individual responsibility, suggested that immigrants themselves also have a role to play in integrating into their new communities and in respecting the cultural norms and values of their host country. The conversation between Farage and Rogan concluded with a discussion of what the future might hold for the UK if the immigration issue is not addressed. Both men expressed concern that the country could be heading towards a period of prolonged social unrest if the government continues to ignore the concerns of its citizens.
If you come here illegally, you will be detained and swiftly removed. People need to know that coming here illegally on a boat will not lead them to a life in the United Kingdom.
The government's message of deterrence is echoing round the migrant camps of Dunkirk, literally.
Farage warned that the anti-immigration riots could be just the beginning, and that unless the government takes decisive action, it could find itself facing an even larger and more determined backlash from the public. Rogan, who has often spoken about the dangers of political polarization, suggested that the situation in the UK could lead to a further fracturing of society, with different groups retreating into their own echo chambers and with political discourse becoming increasingly toxic. Farage and Rogan's conversation has sparked a significant amount of debate in both the UK and abroad, with many people expressing support for their critique of Starmer's leadership. However, their comments have also been met with strong criticism from those who believe that they are oversimplifying a complex issue.
In 2014, Keir Starmer was knighted for services to criminal justice. A year later, he was elected as Labour MP for a London constituency and rose quickly within the party. He served as an opposition spokesman on immigration and also Brexit.
For the Labour Party, this is a very difficult bill.
And that their rhetoric could inflame tensions further. Critics of Farage and Rogan argue that their focus on immigration ignores other important factors contributing to social unrest, such as economic inequality, housing shortages, and the impact of austerity measures. Moreover, some have accused Farage and Rogan of using their platform to promote a divisive agenda that plays on people's fears and prejudices. They argue that by framing the immigration issue in such stark terms,
52% of people said they think Labour aren't telling the truth about what they really think about immigration. Not much better for the Conservatives, only 49% here, so not a big difference, saying the same thing about them. The Lib Dems doing slightly better, maybe they spelt it out better. But every region, every demographic distrusted the main two parties here on this point.
Farage and Rogan are contributing to a climate of hostility and suspicion that could make it even more difficult to find a constructive solution to the crisis. These critics suggest that what is needed is not more rhetoric, but rather a balanced and thoughtful approach to immigration that takes into account both the needs of the country and the rights of immigrants. Nigel Farage and Joe Rogan left off. The pair's critique of Keir Starmer extends beyond just the issue of immigration.
Officials have introduced new border controls with Slovakia, but there's been a spike in migrants passing through, and where an election is also set to take place. The right-wing candidate leading the polls wants to suspend EU rules on open movement.
They argued that Starmer's leadership reflects a broader crisis within the UK's political establishment, a crisis of vision, decisiveness, and connection with the electorate. As they see it, the current leadership is emblematic of a political class that is increasingly divorced from the everyday realities faced by ordinary Britons. For Farage and Rogan, the failure to address immigration is just one symptom of a deeper malaise in British politics. Farage, with his long history of challenging the status quo, suggested that Starmer's inability to lead effectively is rooted in his background as a career politician, a figure who has spent more time navigating the corridors of power than understanding the needs of the public.
But whether you voted Labour or not, in fact, especially if you did not, I say to you directly, my government will serve you. Politics can be a force for good. We will show that.
Farage emphasized that Starmer's approach to leadership is characterized by a cautiousness that borders on paralysis. He suggested that Starmer is more concerned with maintaining his political image and avoiding controversy than with taking the bold steps necessary to address the pressing issues facing the UK. This, according to Farage, is why Starmer has been unable to develop a coherent strategy to deal with immigration, despite the growing unrest it has caused. Rogan, who often draws on his experiences as an outsider to the political system, agreed with Farage's assessment. He argued that career politicians like Starmer often lose touch with the people they are supposed to represent because they are insulated from the real-world consequences of their decisions.
There's been mood for change in Britain. Now, after 14 years in the political wilderness, Labour is back, with Sir Keir Starmer about to move into 10 Downing Street.
We have one job, which is to make this a summer of change.
Rogan suggested that this disconnect is particularly evident in Starmer's handling of immigration, where a lack of urgency and a fear of political backlash have led to a series of half measures that satisfy no one. In Rogan's view, this is symptomatic of a broader failure of leadership in Western democracies, where political leaders are increasingly out of step with the needs and desires of their constituents. The duo delve deeper into what they perceive as Starmer's lack of a clear guiding vision for the UK. Farage argued that the Prime Minister's leadership is reactive rather than proactive, focused more on managing crises as they arise than on shaping the future of the country.
The UK is struggling to deport over 1,000 illegal immigrants back to the countries they came from, according to government ministers. The Home Office said a backlog of over 1,000 people had formed in attempting to remove them from the UK back to countries where they had already claimed asylum. This summer has seen record numbers of illegal immigrants making their way to Britain in boats. A record 409 people were found on vessels yesterday and intercepted by Border Force Control.
He pointed out that Starmer has failed to articulate a compelling vision for the UK's post-Brexit future, leaving the country adrift at a time when strong leadership is desperately needed. Farage contrasted this with his own experience during the Brexit campaign, where he argued that a clear, bold vision was what ultimately persuaded the British public to vote to leave the European Union. Rogan supported this view, noting that successful leaders are those who can inspire people with a clear and compelling narrative about the future. He argued that part of the reason for Starmer's struggles is his failure to connect with the electorate on an emotional level. Rogan suggested that Starmer comes across as a technocrat, someone who is more comfortable with policy details than with big-picture ideas. This, he argued, is a significant drawback in a political landscape where voters are increasingly looking for leaders who can speak to their hopes and fears.
I have a great deal of sympathy with those who are so desperate as to put their children in dinghies or even children's paddling pools and try to cross the channel. But I have to say that what they are doing is falling prey to criminal gangs, and they are breaking the law. They're also undermining the legitimate claims of others who would seek asylum in this country,
rather than just managing the day-to-day operations of government. As the conversation continued, Farage and Rogan turned their attention to the issue of trust in leadership. Farage argued that one of the reasons for the rise of populist movements across the globe is the growing distrust of traditional political elites. He suggested that Starmer's failure to address the immigration crisis has only deepened this mistrust, as it reinforces the perception that the political class is either unwilling or unable to deal with the issues that matter most to ordinary people. Farage argued that this erosion of trust is dangerous because it undermines the very foundations of democratic governance. When people lose faith in their leaders, he suggested, they become more susceptible to extreme ideologies and more willing to take matters into their own hands, as seen in the recent riots. Rogan, who has often discussed the importance of trust in public institutions, agreed with Farage's concerns. He argued that the failure of leaders like Starmer to address key issues like immigration—
The parties have been talking about immigration, but what does the public think? Well, an exclusive poll for Sky News has found that across the country, 43% of people asked thought that immigration has a negative impact on British society. That's compared to 35% here who say it has a positive impact. So clear difference.
Is contributing to a broader crisis of confidence in democratic institutions. Rogan suggested that this crisis is not just limited to the UK, but is part of a global trend where people are increasingly disillusioned with traditional politics. He pointed to the rise of populist leaders in the United States, Europe, and elsewhere as evidence that people are looking for alternatives to the established political order. Rogan warned that if mainstream politicians do not start addressing the concerns of their constituents, they risk being swept aside by more radical voices. The conversation then shifted to the impact of immigration on the UK's economy and public services, with Farage and Rogan arguing that Starmer's failure to control immigration has had serious consequences for the country's infrastructure.
Well, do you think it would be a good idea if you had if you were running your own immigration policy, which of course Britain doesn't because we're EU members, do you think it'd be a good idea to get a lot of people to come who didn't speak English? Do you think that would aid and abet integration in society? Well, the answer, of course, to that clearly is no.
Farage pointed to the strain on the National Health Service, NHS, schools and housing as evidence that the UK is struggling to cope with the influx of immigrants. He argued that the government's failure to plan for the impact of immigration on public services has led to overcrowding, longer waiting times, and increased pressure on resources. Farage suggested that this is not only unfair to British citizens, who are finding it increasingly difficult to access the services they pay for through their taxes, but also to immigrants, who are being blamed for problems that are ultimately the result of poor government planning. Rogan, who has a strong interest in the relationship between immigration and economics, agreed with Farage's assessment. He argued that while immigration can bring economic benefits, it must be managed carefully to avoid overwhelming the country's infrastructure. Rogan suggested that Starmer's government has failed to strike the right balance between welcoming immigrants and ensuring that the UK's public services can cope with the additional demand. He pointed out that this failure is leading to growing resentment among the public, who feel that they are being asked to shoulder the burden of a poorly managed immigration system. Rogan warned that unless the government takes steps to address these concerns,
what we want to do is to change our relationship with the European Union, take back control of our borders, and put in place a positive immigration policy, one that the people of Britain would overwhelmingly support, and by that I mean we want an Australian-style point system to decide who comes to live, work and settle in this country.
it risks further fueling the anti-immigrant sentiment that has already led to violence. Farage and Rogan also discussed the cultural impact of immigration, with both men expressing concern about the erosion of traditional British values and the rise of identity politics. Farage argued that uncontrolled immigration is leading to the fragmentation of British society, as different cultural groups increasingly live separate lives with little interaction or integration. He suggested that this is creating a divided society where people are more likely to identify with their ethnic or cultural group than with the nation as a whole. Farage warned that this could lead to a weakening of national identity and a loss of social cohesion, as different groups compete for resources and influence. Rogan, who has often spoken about the importance of cultural cohesion, echoed Farage's concerns. He argued that the failure to integrate immigrants into the broader society is contributing to the rise of identity politics, where people are increasingly defining themselves by their ethnic or cultural background rather than by shared national values. Rogan suggested that this is a dangerous trend because it undermines the idea of a common national identity and makes it more difficult to build a cohesive society. He pointed to the rise of political movements based on ethnic or cultural identity as evidence that this trend is already having a significant impact on the political landscape. The discussion then turned to the question of what can be done to address the immigration crisis and the broader issues it has raised. Farage argued that the first step is for the government to take control of the UK's borders and to implement a more selective immigration policy. He suggested that the UK should prioritize immigrants who can contribute to the economy and integrate into British society rather than those who are likely to rely on public services or who do not share British values. Farage also called for a greater emphasis on integration, with measures to ensure that immigrants learn English, respect British laws and customs, and become part of the broader society. Rogan agreed that stronger border controls and a more selective immigration policy are necessary, but he also emphasized the importance of addressing the underlying social and economic issues that have contributed to the immigration crisis. He argued that the government needs to invest in public services, particularly in areas that have been most affected by immigration, to ensure that they can cope with the additional demand. Rogan also suggested that the government needs to do more to address the economic inequalities that have fueled resentment towards immigrants, such as the lack of affordable housing and the decline of traditional industries in many parts of the country. Both men also called for a more honest and open debate about immigration, arguing that the current political climate makes it difficult to discuss the issue without being accused of racism or xenophobia. Farage suggested that this has led to a situation where politicians are afraid to address the concerns of their constituents for fear of being labeled as intolerant. He argued that this stifling of debate is counterproductive because it prevents the development of effective policies to manage immigration. Rogan, who has often spoken about the importance of free speech, agreed that a more open and honest debate is needed. He suggested that this would allow for a more nuanced discussion of the issue, where the benefits and challenges of immigration can be weighed against each other in a constructive way. As the conversation drew to a close, Farage and Rogan reflected on the potential consequences of inaction. Farage warned that if the government does not take decisive action to address the immigration crisis, it risks losing the trust of the public and paving the way for more extreme political movements. He pointed to the rise of populist parties in Europe as evidence that people are willing to turn to more radical options when they feel that their concerns are being ignored. Farage suggested that the UK could be heading down a similar path unless the government starts taking the immigration issue seriously. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, could you leave your comments below and tell us? Do you agree with Farage and Rogan's criticism of Keir Starmer? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.